So today we are starting a new teaching for the book of James, and we are going to spend some time looking at a few different things that the book of James will kind of lead us towards over the next few weeks. I have a large study that's not even part of these 4 pages that I made so far that hopefully I'll spend some time writing about this weekend that I think will be good for us to look at, dealing with temptation a lot. James is going to cover that in the first chapter. But let's just start off reading, and again, as I've done in the past, anything that you see in the box is the text that we're studying or reading in James. Anything else outside of that is just going to be commentary or food for thought, things for us to think about. The very first line, and this is a New American Standard, this is commonly what I use when I copy and paste the scripture. New American Standard says, James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad, greetings. And a lot of thoughts came flooding to me when I was using the tool that I have, Bible Works 101, something that was referred to me years ago. And those features that I have set up on that is whenever I do a scripture search, I have the complete Jewish Bible translation pops up. And I don't even know why I necessarily have that, because I seldom use it, and I seldom, not that I seldom disagree with some of its translation, but sometimes some of its translation isn't necessarily, it has a little bit of an agenda too, and it's trying to pitch an agenda of Jewish foundation, Jewish roots that in and of itself is necessarily wrong, but sometimes David Stern's translations are more in a line of trying to make sure people see the Torah is still relevant, when at the end of the day, in some translations, you just need to translate what Paul said for what Paul said. And you need to understand, like there can be a balance on either side. You have to have a balance of both. You have to understand the relevancy of it, but you also have to understand the correct prioritization of things. So, but in this particular case, I wanted to draw something out for us. I wanted us to be aware of something. In the complete Jewish Bible, it says, from Yaakov, a slave of God, and the Lord Yeshua the Messiah, to the 12 tribes in the diaspora. Now, Yaakov is Jacob in Hebrew. James is the name Jacob. So I just wanted you to recognize something about this. Yaakov, interestingly, and I could have put the Hebrew here and gone much more into detail about this, I just didn't, but if you remember, Jacob was born clutching the heel. Now, everything I'm going to share with you about Jacob, I want you to keep in mind of who this individual is. James is the brother of Yeshua. Okay? And if you've read through James, which most of you, if not all of you, probably have, you would know a lot of language and a lot of what his things are that he's going to give us command and instruction about, right? Jacob was born clutching his brother's heel. Now, I honestly don't know for sure. I think James is older than Yeshua. I'm not really sure. But imagine the relationship between a brother when your brother happens to be the Son of God and happens to be someone who's going to perform miracles and teach the correct observance of the law and things of this nature. Imagine your relationship might be a little different. You might not care so much if he can turn water into wine. If he's ticking you off, you might still want to hit him in the head.
Right.
You understand? I mean, there's probably a different type of relationship between brothers that we have humanly that also existed between them, which would also be part of the bond that would enable them to stick much more closely together than perhaps even we could in our relationship with Yeshua.
Hold on, I'm confused. I didn't think Mary had any children before.
No, Mary was a virgin.
Yes. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Right,
Yeah,
that was no trouble.
Having her drink.
I'm
so
really
I'm wrong
confused
about
as
the
to
age.
what I'm talking about. Like, what?
Yeah, so I'm wrong about the age. I'm sorry, but he is the oldest. But she did have other children.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Then,
Yeah, so I'm sorry. I had that backwards
I was like,
clearly. But
man, I really got something wrong. Okay.
yeah, so I had that backwards clearly, but the
Don't make me be too.
yeah.
Good.
Yeah, sometimes it's good to just shut up, right?
But nobody was correcting you, so I just sat there. I was like, I'm not sure what's going on here, but I gotta ask this one.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I was just imagining something, I guess, that just wasn't the case, because I was putting into perspective a little bit more comparison of what I should have been between Jacob and Esau. Okay, because James was younger clearly than Yeshua, but Jacob was younger than Esau. He came out clutching his brother's heel. So I was thinking backwards of the relationship of the older having an issue with the younger, where in my mind I put it that way, but that's not what the issue would have been. Here it would have been the issue potentially with the younger, maybe taking offense at the older or whatever else. But either way, my point was this. Jacob, when he's born, he comes out clutching his brother's heel. And so there's a very close, intimate relationship between Jacob and Esau. And the relationship between the two of them later, will turn into, which clearly some of this doesn't apply to, Yeshua and James' relationship. But Jacob is an individual who, and after obtaining the birthright, is the father of the 12 tribes, and he ends up in a relationship where he is nearly split in two with the relationships that he has to form with Jacob or with Rachel and Leah. So if you remember the story, he goes in, he wants to be with one girl, and Laban, fools him into taking the other, and so he has to work for another 7 years. And so he finds himself being pulled and divided in a lot of different directions. And then he finds that, giving way to 12 boys, let alone other girls that he also had through the different women that, were their mothers or whatnot, through all of the children that would come from Jacob, he's going to obviously be pulled in a lot of directions. And there's going to be a lot of, struggles in how to provide for a lot of different responsibilities that you may have and what to do. And I found it interesting as I was thinking about some of just Jacob's life altogether, that this man who's named after him is, at least the first chapter certainly, and then going into the other chapters, it's clearly all of almost that language that's being discussed. There's a lot of commandments and a lot of instruction that are given about how to have your being and how to handle yourself, how to grow and mature yourself, and how to deal with being stretched between two different places. In fact, in one place, he's going to talk clearly about what a double-minded man looks like and what his issues would be. And I just think there's some relevance to that. So James, just in the simple connection, James is a name for Jacob. They're one and the same. And the translation that Stern does use in this verse, referring himself as a slave of God, is what the word doulos means. It is softly, pleasantly translated as bondservant. Now, in your minds, I'm going to suspect that, like mine, in your minds, the difference between slave and bondservant is going to have everything to do with will, right? And whether or not you can subject yourself or whether you've been subjected, and what the choices that you've made in between, and blah, blah, blah. And the real point to get from this is that the curse of thinking of yourself as a bondservant, in a way, would be that it's very easy for you to justify the days you don't want to serve. As opposed to recognizing yourself as, regardless of how I feel, I don't have a choice. This is what's expected of me. Now, certainly the treatment of God versus the treatment of human beings over those that serve is going to be different. God is fair. He is just. I would much rather be in his hands than be in the hands of men if my fate were being decided. If I need discipline or I need punishment in my life, I would much rather be in the hands of God than in the hands of men, because men will either under-discipline or over-discipline on a regular basis.
With their agenda.
Yes,
Yeah.
nearly never. I mean, even if we're trying to be fair, even if we're trying to be correct with children, even if we're trying to do what's right to help raise them, nearly never are we going to hit the nail on the head with doing correctly what's needed to bring them exactly where they need to be. We're either over or we're under. So being in the hands of God, subjecting yourself to that, or looking at your will as irrelevant to some degree, and only recognizing that your free will has been given to help increase the amount of intention that you have behind getting done what you need to do, is what makes, part of the ability for the character to be refined, for us to grow, for us to mature.
So whether a servant or a slave, the struggle is real.
Yes. Yes. And if you were looking at this passage, and this is something that the translators do, because there's always the mindset that we want to go along with what we want people to read, right? If we write a book, if we're reading something, if we make a movie, whatever it is, that's what you're trying to tap into. And when the translators are looking at the word doulos, there's a couple different words for slave. Some of them do mean for hire. Some of them do mean put into forced servitude. The word doulos is able to be translated as bondservant, or it's able to be translated as slave. And depending on the context of the person will determine whether or not it's this way. If it's a bad situation, 9 times out of 10, then the word's going to get translated as slave. When it talks about a woman being a slave of a man who's using her because she's filled with a spirit to be walking around, like all of that carries a negative connotation to it, right? Mm-hmm. And so we refer to her as a slave, and we look at her as being subjected to things she shouldn't be. And part of the emphasis that I want to make is we are supposed to be looking at ourselves as a servant of God walking around with a spirit inside of us. The question is, what would God subject us to versus what are we subjecting ourselves to? In her case, clearly her master, which is a man, is going to subject her to things that are just going to earn him money and make whatever he needs. In a way, God is going to choose to subject things to us that make life profitable for him. But the benefit of that is realizing that if it's profitable for God, it's profitable for everybody involved.
But can you have them both in your life, slave and servant?
At any moment, you're going to be falling in and out. And I think part of the point I'm trying to make is that it's really going to be your attitude. It's really going to be your attitude of how you look at things.
Well, there's been things in my life where I was led to go that direction and to do them. And I had no choice in the matter. It was like, and we've talked about a little bit of that, so I'm not going to go into it. But it was where I really had no choice in the matter. I just did what the Spirit was guiding me to do, not even knowing exactly what I was getting into. But as a servant, I needed to continue to study to understand that.
Yeah, immaturity makes it much more difficult, right, to choose to walk in obedience. You guys have heard me bring this up several times. The psalmist writes at one point, taste and see that the Lord is good. So the emphasis is don't stand around waiting until you can see things clearly to figure out whether or not you're going to be obedient. Plan to taste of what God has prepared for you if you're clear that he did it. I mean, if you just spent one moment thinking to yourself, well, yes, I'm 100% convinced that God is the one that's providing this opportunity in my life, but I'm not so sure I'm going to get into it until I know that it's going to be good for me.
Yeah.
Like, how do those two statements even go together? But that's usually the attitude that we take. I can clearly know that God's in control of everything that's going on in my life, and I want everything good from him because only good things come from God. But let me see first. Like that, those two they're oxymorons. They're not going to go together, but yet we put them together all the time. It's only because of maturity or exposed experience, consistent experience and choosing to be obedient that eventually we learn to just stop wasting the time asking a question.
Yeah.
You just move forward, do what you need to. But
as fed up with work as I can get, yesterday I had 3 things proved to me, like I needed proof, that that's where I should be. Everybody got a pay increase. Everybody's going to get more PTO. And I met 2 people. One was a lot more knowledgeable and convicted about Jesus and the Bible. The other one called me a Bible scholar, and I'm thinking, okay, yeah, right. But both of these gentlemen were very encouraging to me that I run into more people like that than I run into people that, I wish I were an octopus with 8 arms to slap them all. And it is getting worse, even at Canby Meyer, with the lack of discipline of children, the disrespect of other people and other possessions from adults, and their lack of controlling their children. And yet, in the next breath, I think I'm 0.7 from work. I just got a pay increase company-wide, but the point is, more PTO. I have good benefits for a part-time person. Shut up and stop complaining and get up and be grateful that you've got what you want.
I mean, that does happen, and there are moments when we need to just take stock and find value in that.
Yeah.
We all have moments when we're out. Yeah.
Are you gonna get to the last words here, in that?
As far as the diaspora or shalom or what?
Right, because they both go to the 12 tribes, okay?
Yes.
And then diaspora, diaspora, shalom, and dispersed greetings. Is that the same thing?
Yes. Yeah, there's really not much more to be said about that. The diaspora literally just means, it's a big fancy word for talking about those that have been dispersed abroad.
Gotcha.
And so there was a point in time when the tribes were scattered, and there's been several points in time.
Right.
There was a time when they were scattered and they were abroad, and so James is writing to something. Because by the time Yeshua's come, so much more innovation and technology and so many more people are on the earth that people are having to spread out, and they are having to go to different places. And one thing, just to fast forward us way far ahead, one thing that I found very fascinating that I hadn't even considered or really thought about, like in my mind I had things wrong, like I clearly did about the birth of Yeshua this morning, but I saw something that talked about Yeshua being with his family growing up and living in the wilderness. There's a passage from Luke that shared that, and it just struck me like for some reason because my own personal preference when I moved out here from Akron, Ohio, was I was looking at all these houses that had lots of land where Jen wanted to live and have chickens and farms and plants, all this stuff that I was like, no. And or I could live in a residential community where my neighbor was like, their house is 5 feet away from me, and that's what I prefer, right? I prefer that type of community, and for whatever reason, because of that preference, it was shocking to me to think that in their particular life or dislike, that family had chosen to live in a space that was potentially further away from other people. And to me, it just makes sense that they would have been more inclined to live closely together, or they would have been more inclined to be in a city or to be, city people. But I'm sure that there's no difference then as there is today that people they're of all kinds. There are some that like to be together, and there are some that like to have their space. You know what I'm saying?
I think also that it has to do with what you do outside of your living time. When I leave Meyer, except for this little group, I really don't care if I see anybody. My family, but I'm done with people. I'm peopled out.
That's me. I didn't leave my house last night. I didn't like
Yeah, and it's true. The motivation to see anybody and have any kind of conversation is gone. Yeah.
Yeah. And I go through phases, clearly. A lot of you that know me, that I've spent time talking to know, I go in and out of phases of sometimes I could be content with, being around large groups of people, and other times I'd rather not be around one or two, So it's very difficult, and I've had to make a lot of changes in my life to change and to grow to a point where I can understand the work God would prepare for. So speaking and thinking of the work God would prepare for us, the very next verse in line of James' epistle here.
Yeah, I see.
Please, when we read this, I'm going to read it in context so that you know it. It says, "Consider it all joy, my brother, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing."
Yes.
So there's a little bit of discussion point I have. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials. Say again, could you repeat that last part? And if you would refer to the picture on the right of the page, please.
Yeah. Yeah.
What does that mean? And what does it look like?
Yeah.
It's real hard to sometimes remember to be happy and joyous when you're in a trial, though. But I mean, there are times where you just rail against God, and then there's other times where you can sit back and go, okay, I don't know why I'm here, but
maybe that's what I should have is a tattoo reminding me that, he's got this. I just need to smile. And his purpose is his purpose, and I may not know it. And
maybe it's the wilderness, and that's the place of learning.
Exactly. Yep. And when you get through that wilderness and you look back, you think, wow, I'm still standing. Not by my will, but by his.
And did you learn anything?
Oh, geez, yeah. He sends me around the mountain many times just to, remind me that around the mountain.
Yeah, that's the main thing. Did you learn anything?
Oh, yeah.
the compass got
And what? And at the end of the day,
Yeah.
what are you doing with it?
Yep.
I love the cat's face.
Oh, me
in the
too.
picture.
Because that is
Because-
typical cat,
Yes.
you know.
And it's typical me when a tribulation comes along or something. And I have to make a confession to you guys. It was probably about, I'm going to say around 25 years ago that I really began to make an intentional effort to understand God and to read the scripture. And one of the very first places that I found myself in that very first year was in James. And still to this day, 25 years later, I don't know that I can understand what it means to consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you face trials and tribulations. But something did occur to me. And I don't want to move too fast through this area. If you guys have more that you want to say about what this means to you, please certainly feel free. But something occurred to me that is where this next question comes from. What is joy and where does it come from?
Most people find joy in peace, which is the opposite of a tribulation.
Well, that's an interesting insight, and I can share something with you about peace that I heard from Rabbi Kibbutz, which was mind-altering for me. He said that peace is not, I want to make sure I put this correctly so we understand it correctly. He said something to the degree that peace is not two objects in agreement with one another in harmony. Real peace is two objects in opposition to one another in harmony.
Absolutely.
And that is a major insight. That's a major insight
Can
to
you
have.
say it again?
So peace is not two objects in agreement with one another that are in harmony. But peace is two objects that are in opposition to one another that are in harmony. And that, he goes on to say, is precisely what a marriage is.
Now,
Because-
maybe that's a marriage.
because of the-
I am my husband.
Yeah, I mean, that's the first biggest, that's the biggest component to recognize that peace really is two opposite proponents, two things that are basically two sides of the same coin,
Yes.
right? And so they are in harmony with one another as opposed to being just in battle and in opposition.
My answer would have been, it's an inside job.
Yeah.
I don't understand. What do you mean? Joy?
Joy.
Is it what your answer?
The joy?
Yeah.
Joy is an inside job. It doesn't mean I have to be happy about it,
No,
okay?
no.
But the joy that's inside of me is my peace of mind. Not whether I'm right or whether I'm wrong or anything like that. It's just that
It's contentment to...
I'm content with me. With me.
Right,
I may not be content with you, but I'm content with me. And so no matter what your position is, so take that. You've got two people in opposition with each other, okay? Can they still be friends and enjoy things?
yeah. Gotcha.
Yes, they can. They're not always in battle with each other. They just are not in agreement with each other on certain issues.
So yeah, there's nothing wrong about any of that, but I'm still looking for something very basic that we covered in here not too long ago, a few months ago, that is a pretty basic, simple, direct answer to the first question, which is, what is joy? And this hit me like a ton of bricks when it came to me the other day, and it would help, I think. It will help to know when James gives us this command. Let's even call it a command. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials. I'll just tell you, and then we can spend some time talking about it. Joy is one of the fruits of the Spirit. It's that simple.
Yeah.
It's one of the fruits of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. So, if joy is what we are supposed to see and have and be prepared to experience in a trial or tribulation, then that should absolutely be a sign to us that God's presence is there, that it's in the trial.
Yeah.
I've never thought about it that way. I mean, of course, on the surface, you want to tell yourself that, and you want to try and convince yourself of that. But, and this isn't real easy to get across when you're in the middle of a trial, and it's only ever through hindsight that you get it. But at the end of the day, we should be able to look at God being in every experience that we have, even some of the most horrendous. Now, of course, when you're going through it hindsight is not there, it's not present for you, and when you're going through it, to be able to say God has orchestrated this and desires for this, and he's in control of what's going on, is difficult to do. But to master your self-control, to master who you are, and to get to that place will require that. Now, some of where I could go in this teaching is going to be quite the opposite of what I shared with you concerning the doctrine of election or the doctrine of predestination, because I share very clearly that I don't want people believing and thinking that God has ordained and determined that no matter what they do against their free will, they are either a vessel for destruction to go to hell, or they are a vessel of salvation that can go immediately to heaven, because then that even refutes the potency of Yeshua's choice, right? Because if God already decided before Yeshua came and dwelt in the flesh who was going to go to heaven and who was going to go to hell, then what was the point of Yeshua, right? There's no sense in that. And I've never met somebody who believes in the doctrine of election or predestination that isn't so ego-ridden that they don't already believe, even when they do things that offend people, that God clearly ordained for them to do that. I see that there's usually ego that leads them. So that's the danger of teaching and believing and focusing on that teaching. But now I'm going to throw that all under the bus and tell you that at the end of the day, the most mature point that you can reach in your life is recognizing that everything that comes into your life has been by the hand of God.
Yes.
He has determined all of those things. There isn't anything you experience that hasn't come from his hand. Otherwise, you would say, in admitting something otherwise, that you were capable of being outside of his hand. And Yeshua says no one can snatch out of God's hand.
Is there a commandment inside of this then? Like where joy during the trials, okay, is going to leave you perfect and complete, lacking nothing. But yet many times that's not what people do. And so is there a commandment inside of that to have joy that you even went through the trial? And for whatever it is that you learn from it, instead of, oh, feel sorry for me.
Yeah.
So my grandmother always said, and I don't know, I can't remember if she was Methodist or not, but they were always taught that God disciplines those that he loves the most, right? And he loves everybody, so sometimes your trials are your discipline and your refinement, as we've called it in here. But she always taught us, be happy when you get disciplined, because it means he hasn't forgotten you and he still loves you. And that's how she would find joy whenever there was a trial or a tribulation. She'd say, well, God still loves me because this is the evidence of it, because I did something that needed his correction. And so some of you guys have heard this before, but when my son was about that tall, he got in trouble, and I was trying to explain to him that we disciplined him because we loved him. And he looked at me and said, well, could you love me less? So the joy I always find in trials is remembering that he hasn't forsaken me, and he wants me to improve my character. He wants me to improve something.
So I was never happy over a whoop.
Oh, come on.
Yeah.
All right? And sometimes it develops a hatred.
Mm-hmm.
Everything has two sides.
Yeah.
It can develop joy or it can develop a hatred. I know many people who say things like that God just hates me because he kept doing all these things to me.
Yep.
I've heard that 100 times.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
I was going to say, does it build respect? So, like I said, when you got the whip, and you respected, like your father who did it or whatever later on, in life or whatever.
Part of the issue, we're really getting into some deep, also psychological stuff here to understand where the mindset of a Christian should be. Part of the problem, and again, we can only do this because we aren't, I'm guessing most of us are not going through any major tribulations right now, right? Otherwise, you'd be getting probably angry and frustrated at being told, God is clearly orchestrating this in my life right now. But part of the big issue as to that situation is that what do you give credit for the finality of things in this life to? Are you giving it to God, or are you giving it to the event? Because if a loved one dies, and the finality of that transfer from life to death is a finality for you, and you don't, what that reveals in a way, this is difficult, but what that reveals is that you're not really looking at this life as being temporary and the eternal life with God as your source. What you're looking at is this life being your source. because now a finality has been created and something's been removed and you don't have hope. And that's what the problem is, that hope is removed when a finality comes along. Like, we only hope. We don't hope for things we can see. If I'm stranded, and it's late at night, and I'm stranded, and no one's coming, and I look everywhere in the distance, and there's no lights anywhere, and then suddenly, on the road, I see lights coming or whatever, my hope will vanish. If I've called and asked somebody if they can help me, my hope altogether is going to vanish, because now I have an expectation that I see it getting closer and closer and closer and closer.
Right.
So we don't hope for what we can see, we hope for the things that we can't see.
Right.
And when some form of finality, which is, and when I use the word finality, I want you to understand that it's you or I who makes that word definitive and become an actual finality of whatever the circumstances. Because oftentimes when we're going through something, through tribulation, and what we think is a finality comes, it's just another obstacle that God may allow to be there for us to realize, okay, listen, are you really putting stock in that? Or are you putting stock in me? Because regardless of the fact that, Lazarus died is irrelevant. I weep because all of you are sad thinking that it's a finality, but I'm about to resurrect him.
Exactly.
So for you, this is a finality because your mind has reached that point. But for me, I'm not there. So his weeping and his sadness, I don't believe, was for the fact that Lazarus died. I think his sadness was for the way that people were interpreting that, because they all claimed to be believers. They all claimed to be, religious Jews who did the same things every day with a practice of believing that they would have a relationship with God, and suddenly when something came as a tribulation, they threw it all out the window.
When my mom died from lung cancer, I never blamed God. He didn't say, here's this cigarette, boom, and light it for her. That was her choice. And all it did, and I know, maybe it sounds unbelievable, was bring me closer to God.
Mm-hmm.
It was never, there were moments when I was upset with her because she had smoked. But there, for the grace of God, I smoked too. Fortunately, my CAT scan and the scans I've had, I have nothing wrong with my lungs or my entrails. So the trauma that I went through with all this to get this, look what I found out because of it. I'm going to be around to haunt my kids a long time unless I get hit by a bus out here. But, yeah.
So, go ahead.
I was going to say, Psalm 16:11 says, we read, you make known to me the path of life.
Yeah.
In your presence there is fullness of joy, and at your right hand are pleasures forevermore. Fullness meaning the presence of God puts more joy and gladness in our hearts than anything else in this world. And that's the gift he gives.
Yes.
Eternal life.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're getting somewhere to understand what it means, and again, because of the hindsight at our age where we've had trials and tribulations, we're able to look back and see that now moving forward we need to have it. But we should still be asking a very poignant question. If we truly, I'm using quotes here, have arrived into recognizing the sovereignty of God and trust in that, why would we still require tribulation or trials in our life? That's not an unfair question to ask, because if we supposedly have arrived, one, should we expect to still have some? The answer to that's pretty clear, unless, of course, as Donna said, you walk out of here and get hit by a bus.
Yeah.
I don't see buses on the road very often.
No, so think about how weird that would be.
But so think about this for a moment, because we need to understand, again, everything we're talking about is two sides of something, or there are two sides to nearly every conversation we're having. So what is the purpose of the tribulation and trial? Number one, it is a sign, and it should be evidentially recognized by us, that God's Spirit has been sent and is present in that. If we choose to accept it and consider it pure joy, we should have an expectation that working and walking in conjunction, hand in hand with God's Spirit, we will see that fruit produced. Because if it is a fruit of the Spirit, it is something that works in conjunction with the Spirit inside of us, then we should have anticipation to produce it. But again, the question is, why are we going through the tribulation, and why are we expected to produce that fruit? And the answer is to create a sensitivity within us that you should never be at 100% full expression of joy in your life, because while you think you're able to do that, someone somewhere is suffering. Right? Someone else somewhere is suffering. And the trial and the tribulation is to keep us balanced with a sensitivity to realize that there are moments we live through when other people would much rather die while they're in the middle of them. And if we have lived through it and are here, we are capable of sharing with them whatever mechanism might have been used to help us survive it.
Right. Yeah.
That sensitivity has to be developed in us. That's the purpose of the trial and the tribulation. If you go in the opposite direction, then what you do is you go into sadness. And sadness, I'm just going to put this bluntly so that we understand, sadness is selfishness.
Oh, yeah.
We should be able to
Yes.
experience grief, and we should recognize when a loved one or someone else passes that we can be sensitive and be there with them. Sit Shiva with them is what it's referred to in the Jewish community, where when someone dies, for 1 full year, there is a whole process of things that you do and don't do, and that you come alongside that individual and help them when their spouse dies after that. I mean, I could go into things that would probably amaze you as far as what commandments even an individual in Jewish tradition is told not to observe when their spouse dies, like the wearing of tzitzit. It may sound like a strange one, but the soul that has died, that is trying to transition into an eternal realm, no longer has the opportunity to hang the tzitzit. And so when you go to their grave, or when you go around anything that would be reminiscent of who they are, you're not to wear tzitzit in that first year. Just as, I mean, this may sound strange because we don't look at a soul in its transition process that same way. We don't look at it this way. But as that soul is transitioning from one place to another, there are certain things it no longer can do, clearly, because they're dead, right?
Right.
So there's certain things that you can no longer do. And so just as a simple honor, in relationship, when we're talking about a spousal relationship, because that's supposed to be a unit of one, as opposed to two separate souls, two are joined. And so your soul is to be inflicted to some degree, knowing that theirs is as a transition, so that you can help to make their transition easier. That's all a bunch of stuff you probably didn't expect to hear, but that's part of the thinking. That's part of the traditional thinking behind it. So we, again, should be sensitive. We should be prepared to be sensitive. And we are made sensitive by the trials and tribulations we go through for the benefit of our own refinement and growth later on. And the only couple things that are going to get you there to understanding it is, one, you're going to be capable of producing a fruit of joy working in conjunction with God's Spirit, and you can recognize the sovereignty of who He is to always be in charge, and there isn't anything that is a finality that we experience in this life. There isn't anything that leads to something that is going to be long-lasting. This is all temporary. One of the words I pulled out from this that I wanted us to take a look at is the word encounter. He says, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials." And I put on here, being a little bit sarcastic, jokingly, "Thanks God, even in your randomness, you often always seem to still find me." Does it seem almost random, like maybe the trials and tribulations? Because don't we look at it that way sometimes? That the trials and tribulations that I experience in life just randomly happen to find me? As if God was not in control of making sure that was something I would encounter and go through? Based on what He saw in me, or what He would want to build in me, or what He would want me to build within His community?
It's a never-ending story.
We sometimes tend to think that there's a randomness to it. And yet, then we do get the pity party of, "Whoa, it's always me," and we always think that in His randomness, it's just always me that randomly these things happen to, right? I mean, again, they're oxymoron things that don't get us very far in our understanding or building of who we are. This word encounter, I don't have down here, I don't remember what the Greek word is, but the word was only used in 2 other passages. It's used in Luke 10:30 when it says, "Yeshua replied and said, a certain man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers." He encountered robbers, and they stripped him. So you could, if the translator is going to translate it as "fell among," you could read this as, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you fall among various trials." That has a little bit different connotation to it. And the other passage where this is used is in Acts 27:41 that says, "But encountering or striking a reef where 2 seas met, they ran the vessel aground, and the prow struck fast and remained immovable, but the stern began to be broken up by the force of the waves." Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you are struck by various trials. Where is our footing? I put in here, I'm just going to go ahead and jump to some of this and share it with you now. A clue found in Acts 27:30. I don't recall that I necessarily have to go and read that, but if you go and look that up, you'll find, I believe, that it talks about the prow or the prow of another boat, and that is the location from where the anchor drops. And I did a lot of research, and I started looking because I just really felt compelled to recognize and realize that how you are anchored is going to make every difference about how you encounter things. If you're anchored correctly and you get struck, then you may be stuck fast where you're at, and it will be easier to endure and to get through. If you're anchored correctly, and this is going to seem strange to take this approach, but I'm going to take a very strange approach, one that Dave probably would have been offended by and would probably try to correct me on. But I'm going to take a strange approach to Luke 10 in this passage about this man that we always look at as the Good Samaritan having to care for. Now, the story of the Good Samaritan is about the individual who cares for the man who finds himself in some pretty bad tribulation. But interestingly, it says a certain man, and the word certain is a word. Now see, the scripture does not use words frivolously. And it specifically puts this Greek word in here meaning a certain man. The word certain means a transition from a higher place to a lower place. And for some reason it becomes translated as certain. And it says that a certain man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Are any of you good with maps?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know where Jericho is in relation to Jerusalem?
Lord.
No.
No, it's higher.
It's northeast. North means up. Now, north doesn't necessarily mean up or down. But in our minds, it normally would, right? Normally, you would think that north means above wherever the location is. Now, why is it true, in fact, that Jerusalem would be above Jericho? This isn't too difficult. You just have to geographically know and understand some things. It's a mountainous region. The elevation between Jerusalem and Jericho, although Jericho is above and is north of Jerusalem, the elevation is a difference of about 3,600 feet. Jerusalem is elevated higher because it's in a mountainous region where Jericho is down by the sea. But it's still northeast.
Okay.
So a certain man who made decisions in his life to allow himself to be taken from a higher position to a lower position finds himself falling among robbers.
Gotcha.
Maybe you don't make those kinds of decisions. Or maybe if you do, you realize where you make those kinds of decisions and that there's consequences that come out of them. How quickly do we change? Again, I'm taking some real liberties. I'm taking some real liberties with the story of this individual who falls among robbers when normally we don't look at it as him having done anything wrong. But Peter is also very clear that if you suffer for doing what is wrong, what kind of credit is given to you for that? None. If you come out of it, yes, credit is assigned and credit can be made if you start making better decisions. But usually that credit is offered to those who you are able to give it to. Not necessarily to you, but your circumstances of being able to sit down with someone else and say, hey, don't do this because I was dumb once and did it myself. This is what it resulted in. Usually the credit and the benefit of that story is for that person, not for you.
Kind of like me intentionally going down to 10th and Tibbs and thinking I would be okay at midnight.
I'm guessing that's an area you would find yourself in at that time of night. So if that's...
I assumed, I'm sorry, I assumed you would. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, I know exactly
Okay,
where you're
yeah,
at.
okay.
And that's a no.
So that is what has happened to me, I caused. So it's doubly a blessing that that's all that happened to me, and somebody came by and saved me, which sure wasn't by my hand. I was beaten and laying on the side of the road or whatever. So it had to be from a higher hand that got me out of this mess by this by chance person coming by. That's Very interesting, Phil, very deep.
Yeah,
That's the one I'll ponder today all day.
I look at it as if you know you're not supposed to be doing something.
Yes,
And you decide, I'm going to do it anyway, and then give the credit to God when he has to come save me. I don't feel, I think that's what you're going for. There's that Italian parable about the guy who, like, the rains came and he did get out of his house, but somebody came and said, hey, it's going to flood, you should leave. And he goes, no, it's fine, God will save me. And then the waters get high enough, and then he's on the roof and a boat comes by, and eventually he dies.
yeah,
And he gets there and he's like, why didn't you save me? He's like, I sent you like 8 people.
yes, yeah.
You know? And the guy gets no credit for staying, saying God will save me, and God tried to save him.
Yes,
We make decisions like this in our lives all the time.
yes.
Sometimes on a daily or a weekly basis,
Oh, yeah.
just depending on the situation.
Depending on the level of our stupidity, sometimes it's minute by minute, but, you know,
Sometimes.
we do make decisions. We do make decisions all the time. So the main reason why I went in this direction with that particular parable, and I'm trying to also share with you that, you know, you're not definitively set in stone to look at it that way. But one of the things I wanted you to notice about this is there are pretty much 2 ways that you will encounter trials and tribulation. God brings them to you, or you bring yourself to them.
Yep.
Those are pretty much the only 2 ways.
Well, the other.
One way is to refine your character and to help you get, through the discipline you need to be the person you can become for serving within the kingdom. The other is just because of our stupidity. Because clearly, we are commanded at one point to ask God not to lead us into temptation. Yeshua himself gives us that prayer, as we're going to read here shortly. But I want us to recognize a few other things between these other 2 passages where this word encounter is used. One, the scenario of the Good Samaritan. In that parable, for the most part, is all involving the decisions of men. The second one is all things that happen to an inanimate object. That all happen to a situational thing. Now, if you go back to Acts 27 and you read through the context of that, I may have misunderstood because maybe I didn't read far enough, but the impression that I was given in part was that they were clearly having problems because of a storm on the ship, which does involve men looking to sail it. And interestingly, I started finding all kinds of language to describe a different type of anchor, and I realized that what was going on after I spent like an hour just researching anchors and reading about different things, what I realized is going on is there is an actual anchor that is dropped from the prow of the ship, right, to give it stability so that it stays in one area. But what was translated as an anchor, the Greek word, which I don't remember right now, it's translated as an anchor, is not actually as much of an anchor for the boat going into the sea. It's basically a type of masting that is anchored a certain way, and the first initial mast is open, and it's anchored a certain way so that the trajectory of the ship stays within one particular direction and stays moving within this direction. And so it's referred to as an anchor in the scripture, but in most of the other terminology I find online on Google searches I was doing, it was referred to as a couple of different terms, but it was basically the mast and the sail, and when you look at the Greek word, that also gave it as that definition. But basically, so it's not necessarily an anchor that goes off of the boat into the sea, but it's something that stays on the boat to help with its trajectory. The way you would anchor, the way you would tie down the mast, the way you would tie down or you would anchor the sail is the word I kept looking for. I forget the way you set the sails.
As humans, when trials come, we don't blame ourselves. We always want to blame the devil. Oh, as Christians especially, we want to blame the devil for everything negative that comes in within focus of it.
Yeah, that has always been a big personal pet peeve of mine.
And with that, there's a problem because I use him as a scapegoat instead of responsibility.
Yeah. Well, also, what you're doing is not. We do trick ourselves into thinking that we're blaming the devil, but what we're really doing is giving him credit for something God has brought into our lives, and that's very dangerous. That's bad.
Right.
And that's the key. I've always tried to help people understand that, because when you do have a claim towards understanding the sovereignty of God, then to say, as Job could have but didn't, that it is Satan doing these things to me and whatnot. I mean, he clearly, if you read through the book, gave God credit, even though he was angry and frustrated about it here and there. He gave God credit for everything that was going on. He never blamed Satan and said, Satan's doing this in and of himself, of his own volition, on his own, and he's in charge of what he's choosing to do, and he didn't have to ask permission. He's just doing all this stuff to me. That's wrong. That's a wrong
Right, because
approach.
God could have stopped it any time he wanted. He was truly the one in control, not Satan.
Well, he specifically was, and it's funny because even in Yeshua's time, Yeshua tells the disciples at one point, Satan has requested permission to sift you as wheat.
Yes.
So, and as I've already said during the Passover here, the very simple answer that Yeshua could have said when he's talking to the disciples about this, the very simple answer God could have given is no. It's that simple. Satan comes to him and says, hey, can I do this? And God says, no. But clearly that's not the answer that was given, because Yeshua says, but I have prayed for you.
Yeah.
That when these things happen, you'll be renewed, you'll be restored. I'm paraphrasing the idea. But so clearly the answer that was given when Yeshua, or when Satan requests this, is yes. Clearly that's the answer that's given. And then that's what takes place. So yes, it's important to recognize, and again, to credit in the right degree. In a way, yes, God does sovereignly, in the sovereignty of who he is, orchestrate and ordain all of the circumstances that we go through in our lives. But yes, we can also use our free will to fight against and to make those situations more problematic. And God, in his discipline and in his desire to discipline us to become who we can be, is not going to over-discipline us to where we just become more angry and more bitter and more wicked in what we're choosing to do, especially as we injure others around us because of that. And he's not going to under-deliver whatever is required for our ability to refine our characters. In these two circumstances, with this word encounter, in these two examples, you have a lot of different things we could have drawn, a whole menorah pattern, or make all kinds of connections. We could write two different lists. And I thought about doing that, I just didn't take the time to break it all down. But there are a lot of different things that determine the level of encounters that we have, how they come about, and then how we're going to behave during them. We are commanded to consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Matthew 6, 9 through 13, Yeshua says, pray then in this way, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we have also forgiven our debtors. And do not lead us into temptation. It's the same word, sometimes translated as temptation and sometimes translated as trial or tribulation. But do not lead us into trial or tribulation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. Do not ask God for a trial. There's a whole little story that I have, yes, right at the top of this next page, to tell you about, just to bring into light something that is good.
Same as don't pray for patience.
This is going to have some idea, of biblical context, to help frame it somewhat. But I'm just going to share with you a traditional story. I don't know if it comes from the Talmud or where it comes from, but something that I heard that I think is very poignant for understanding. There's a dialogue that takes place, that is said to take place between King David and God at one point. And you know that in the Scripture is clear in a few places that God is referred to as the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And there's a story, whether it's traditionally believed to be real and actual, or whether it's just something for us to learn from. There's a discussion that takes place between God and David, where David wants to know why it is that his name is not said with God's. And this isn't a man, the way that the story is articulated is that this isn't an individual. This is someone that God chose, and yes, he had some issues, but this is someone that God chose and raised up to be king of his people and to lead them. And so this isn't someone asking facetiously with a self-grandiose ideology of themselves, thinking, more highly than they ought of themselves. This is someone who's legitimately is asking, who's written so much more of what we consider the Bible, right, than other penmans or whatever else, especially when it comes to the Old Testament or whatnot. And so it's not as if David is just being foolish in this. There's a legitimate conversation, and I don't know all of what the Talmud records of the conversation, but the point is, God's answer to him is, the reason why his name is said together with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is because God tested them. And so he chooses, after the endurance of their testing, to have his name repeated with theirs. And so David says, test me. And that night he sees Bathsheba. And that's the end of the story. That's the end of the story. And so the idea of the story is that now you know why his name is not said with God. So again, the moral of the story, the idea is, do not ask God for a test. Do not go looking for them. I've shared with you guys another parable several times. This is another story that talks about what a wicked man is, what a rasha is, what a wicked person. There's a man who has an opportunity of two choices as he's walking home from yeshiva school. He has two options. He thinks to himself that in this road that he takes, he knows that there are women, sometimes modestly or immodestly, bathing and getting dressed on the side of the road where there's a spring. And then this other road over here is, another route that can be taken, and it gets him home. And he thinks to himself how pleasing it will be to God that he takes the road where the women are at. And when he arrives at this place, he turns his head and looks away and makes sure that he doesn't look in any way, shape, or form. And he does so, and immediately is referred to as a rasha, or a wicked man. Because the test was not whether or not you would look. The test was whether or not you would take the road.
Gotcha.
Don't take the road.
Gotcha.
Don't put yourself into a place of testing and temptation expecting that God is going to give you the strength to not do it. Because that's foolishness. That's putting him to the test. That's saying, I know that I'm not capable of surviving this temptation.
Wow.
That's like people with the kids.
Yeah,
They said no prayer for patience.
I know better than that one, but
Why do they always say that?
because you were going to be,
trial or
you're gonna have,
that
to
will
learn patience.
really teach you
Yeah.
patience.
yeah.
So I made that mistake a few years ago, and I guess maybe now that I'm encountering a preteen, I'm
Yes.
getting my trial,
Yeah.
Oh.
because I've got patience, no problem. Till him. Now I have a problem.
So all
Going through school and ask for extra homework from the teacher.
Yeah.
So
This
again,
is a real aha.
as you can see, we're really spending a lot of time delving again into this idea of the types of trials that we will encounter. And we already read the passage of the Lord's Prayer. We're in what is the most basic. I mean, if you really want to know what a holy, righteous man prays to God, go read John chapters, I think it's 15, 16, 17, and 18, because they're all red letter all the way through, and it's all Yeshua's prayers directly in his relationship with God. But if you need a beginning instructory prayer for beginners, that's what the Lord's Prayer is.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to demean it in any way,
No.
but it's a good start, right?
Yeah.
And Yeshua gives us, and gave his disciples when asked what type of prayer they should pray, he gives them instruction in there to ask God not to lead you into trials and tribulation. Because the expectation is that for your character refinement, you need them. So there are times that God's not going to listen to your prayer, and he is going to lead you into them. How much stupider would it be to also walk yourself into as many as you can find? So clearly, do not ask for a test. Pray that God does not lead you into any. Just let you not cause harm in his world. Right? If anything, the prayer of a righteous man is, just leave me alone today. Don't take me into trials and tribulations, and just keep me from causing harm to anyone.
There you go.
Yes.
Yeshua also gives us a couple pieces of insight into how we can avoid temptation, how we can avoid falling into, right, as the word suggests, being struck by temptation or falling into it. Matthew 26, verses 37 through 45, he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee and began to be grieved and distressed. And he said to them, my soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me. And he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as thou wilt. And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping, and said to Peter, so you men could not keep watch with me for even 1 hour? Keep watching and praying, that you may not enter into temptation. It's not just a matter of trying to avoid it. Sometimes you have to pray and be aware and awake. Be attentive to the things around you. Recognize when it may present itself. And don't make yourself available. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. He went away again a second time and prayed, my Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, thy will be done. And he came again and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. And he left them again and went and prayed a third time, saying the same thing once more. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. The kinds of trials and tribulations that God is prepared to go through is an arrest, a beating, and a crucifixion while you and I are sleeping. I shared the rest of this context not just for that, but also for us to see that Yeshua himself went to a solitary, secluded place to pray the same prayer repeatedly. It didn't matter what anybody else was doing, and it didn't matter whether or not an answer was necessarily given. What mattered was whether or not he maintained a consistency. He set the sail of the trajectory of his ship and his vessel in the direction that it needed to be, laid the anchors on the boat, the vehicle of momentum, to arrive in the end result that he himself did not want. His flesh certainly did not want. But since it was required and it was something he would have to endure and go through, he set the anchors of his sails and strapped them down to be able to arrive into that place. Sometimes that will require depriving yourself of something. Sometimes it will require monitoring and limiting yourself, and sometimes there won't be any major requirements of that nature. There won't be a lot of discomfort. Sometimes there will just be a trial and a tribulation you go through for the sake of someone else, and you have a great relationship with God and you get through it. Sometimes they're going to hurt. But either way, having a steadfastness about us is what's going to make the experience what the experience is. Right? And your hindsight later is going to help you to be able to reason out and make sense of some of it. But getting through it and enduring through that is going to be part of the key.
Former pastor, about 6 months ago, I went to his church, and he had our former pastor there. And Steve Reeves made one statement that I have on my mirror, the one that I see every morning. We have the God that is the God of one more move. And that is what I try to say. He's always got one more move. We're not at the end. He's got one more move. And then he'll have another move. And then he'll have another move. So throwing in the towel proverbially, no, he's always got one more move. And I really do try to think about that first thing in the morning. Now, am I thinking about it at 9:30 when someone wants 16 balloons blown up? Probably not. But because it makes sense to me. He's always got an answer. He has always got a step he can take. You may not know it, but he knows it.
The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak.
Exactly.
The spirit is always willing to do what's right, but sometimes the way we try to articulate it in the flesh is walking down the road where the women were changing, and we had no business being on the road.
Exactly.
Because the flesh is weak in knowing how to articulate the spirit. That's why we do not, to walk in the spirit means not to engage the lusts of the flesh. The flesh in and of itself is not the problem. The spirit, certainly, in and of itself, is not the problem. The problem is the soul that you form in the middle and the decisions that it makes and what it wants to do. And it will lean towards one side or the other.
Yes.
It will either lean towards the flesh or lean towards the spirit.
Can God be in both? Because we gain strength from our weakness. So can God be in both?
He's definitely in our weaknesses and he's in our strengths, but he makes I'm thinking of the other verses that say he makes the foolishness, or he makes the wisdom, of the world foolishness, and he makes the foolishness of, the faith of what we believe. He makes it the wisdom of who we are. So I don't know that God's necessarily in the flesh, but he gave us the flesh and created it. He created
Maybe
it from
not
the
in
flesh.
the flesh, but in the weakness. Because
Yeah, he created the flesh, so it's definitely of him. It's from him. He created that from the work of his hands, and then he breathes into it the spirit, and then he gives us charge and responsibility to build something in between those two.
to me, weakness is in the way I'm thinking at that present time. Because my body will follow where my mind leads it. It really wants to. And sometimes it's like, you know better,
Oh, yeah. And you do it anyway.
and you do it anyway. And
And you know the consequences because you've done it before.
you know it's gonna happen.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
and how did that work out for you?
Yeah, same way as it did the first time, or maybe worse because you did it again.
That's right.
Like a piece of duct tape on your arm. You put it there the first time and then, wow, it hurts. You put it there the second time and, oh, that hurt.
But even
But by
back,
about the fifth or sixth time, there's no hair left, doesn't hurt anymore, so
but even back to David, all right? After he fell to the temptation, all right? The song says that she drew a hallelujah from him. So there was a godly something coming out of there, no matter what.
Yeah.
Okay, food for thought later.
Yeah. So I think we will try to get through verses 3 and 4 of James, James chapter 1 today before we're done. But reading out of the box, James 1 verse 3, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Romans 5 verses 3 through 8 are going to help to put this in an even more detailed perspective. And I chose some of the end verses too to have some discussion about that. But it says, and not only this, but we also exult in our tribulations, knowing that tribulation brings about perseverance. And perseverance, proven character, and proven character, hope. And hope does not disappoint because the love of God has been poured out within our hearts through the Holy Spirit who was given to us. For while we were still helpless at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For one will hardly die for a righteous man, though perhaps for a good man someone would dare even to die. But God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. No matter how wonderful we think we are, when we see a righteous person oftentimes being abused or being faced with a chance of death, we are seldom inclined to put our own lives on the line, assuming that they have been righteous enough to take care of themselves. That's a sad place to be, but it's where we're at often. Now, somebody who's good and does a few good things here and there, and we don't look at necessarily as religiously righteous, we might be a little bit more inclined to protect or to take care of. And yet, while we were at the peak of sin, and while we are yet still sinners in our lives, and none of us are free from that, Christ dies for us. That's God recognizing potentiality and allowing for the ability for it to still thrive, having a desire for it to still thrive. and take place in the world. If all God wanted to do was save us so that we could have relationship with him, then why aren't we with him from the moment we get saved? Because God also desires for us to have relationship through him, through Yeshua, with one another here, to become sensitive and to show others what it means and what it would look like to have harmony with one another, as we should expect to have in a heavenly realm. God desires for us to have that type of relationship. To kind of end page 2, I asked to come up with an understanding of this, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. But what about perseverance? We exalt in tribulations, knowing that tribulation brings about perseverance or endurance. What are the differences? What's the difference between endurance and perseverance? How would you define them?
Endurance, to me, always felt like almost like a negative connotation, like I'm going to have to endure this.
Right.
But if I say I'm going to persevere, it's like an active,
You're going to
positive
win at the
role.
end. Yeah.
Like to me, they're both the end result of you're going to make it through something. But it's the attitude about how you did it.
That's it.
Enduring is like, oh, I got to deal with this one more day. Whereas perseverance is like,
You're going in with some
I'm
gusto.
going to do this.
Yeah.
Like I chose to look at it.
Endurance, we're, this, endurance, not endurance. Endurance is the strength to run the race. Perseverance is the attitude of I'm going to make it through and win.
Run the race and win the prize.
Notice that the translators notice a difference. And in one passage, which I hadn't really told you this, but I'm telling you now, in James, it is translated as endurance. In Romans, it's translated as perseverance, but it's the same word. So this word in Greek, which I don't know if I'll be able to pronounce it correctly, I sometimes do not get those words correctly. It looks like it's hyponymy, or hyponymy. Apparently, the Greek word defines a two-sided coin, which is endurance and perseverance. For the statement at the bottom of your page, what I have for myself is perseverance is the anticipated result of consistent endurance. Consistently enduring things and recognizing that you need to find the strength of endurance going through things should result in an intentional effort the next time you face a trial to get through it with joy. Because clearly this word in Greek means both a having to be subjected to and go through, which is the inanimate object of the ship. Its trajectory is established to be set right at a reef where two seas meet, and it's getting the ship closer to an area where as it crashes on the reefs and gets stuck, it will be easier for the men to reach the island. There seemed to be some intentionality in that. When you go back and you read through chapter 27 of Acts, they're looking to throw everything overboard, because this is everything that happens. They throw everything overboard that they can after eating what they feel they need to survive for a few days. And then they set a trajectory of the ship to get them as close as they can to where they need to be grounded.
Run a good race until the end.
And in the other example of the individual, he made some decisions, let's just say, to allow himself to go from an elevated position to a lower position. Maybe didn't think it through, maybe did, maybe thought it was what God's will was, I don't know. I'm not trying to be necessarily negative about the individual and what the Good Samaritan had to do for him, but either way, it definitely was involving men, and some of the men involved, like the robbers, made some decisions that made the situation very painful. It made it very problemsome. The rest of the verses, they left them half dead when they walked away from him. Either way, though, the two-sided coin, as one Greek word, is to recognize that we have to have an intentionality in perseverance to make sure that we start approaching. That's really the goal of having endured all the things you endured in the earlier stages of your life, is that as you see yourself approaching them now, you approach them with perseverance, with an intentionality to get through them, walking hand in hand with God's Spirit, with an expectation of producing the fruit of joy. And remember that the larger fruit and the more fruit that you see produced, working in conjunction with Spirit, is never intended about making you fat with how much it feeds you. It's about feeding others as well. That's why you produce the amount that you do. And if God can take our lives and produce enough to nourish more than ourselves, then that's obviously a good thing. That's reaching a point of maturity. And that should be part of our goal. Again, understanding that endurance is and can be looked at as just getting through something and just having to sit there, sometimes angrily, sometimes resentfully, but you can also choose to get up out of the seat as you're enduring and be intentional about making use of the tools that have been provided to you as you go through that. Because God does not test or tempt anyone beyond what they are able to handle without showing the way of escape. That's the key clincher to that rest of that verse. He doesn't give any of us more than what we're able to handle without also providing the way of escape, albeit through tools or through a direction or through the efforts of other individuals. Whatever it is, he provides something for us to endure. But sometimes the other side of that endurance is perseverance. I think we'll just stop here and pick up on page 3. Looks like we got to the first 4 verses.
Yes, but,
Yay!
and you've given me lots to think about.
Stay up at 10 and tips.
Yeah, well, I have a little story that will be very entertaining for some of you. I decided I would try taking CBD oil for my